Okay, so in this tutorial, we're just going to cover some very basics of the Maya interface and creating a few objects with some parenting. And this is going to be focused on creating a simple little rig for the bend tutorial we do right at the beginning of our intro class. So I'm going to jump in. Some of this I'm going to do rather quickly. And as we're going along here, my apologies for the moving around stuff. I'm using the little magic mouse here, and it doesn't work very well without a 3-button mouse, but that's what we're doing this tutorial with. I'm going to go ahead and create a cube. So the cube itself comes in at the center of the world. I'm going to have this oriented with my Z, my X, and my Y, up and down. So right off the bat, because this cube is 1 by 1 by 1 as far as its size, it's just a default cube, I'm going to move it up 0.5 so that it sits basically on that ground plane. Oops. Alright, so we have that there. And the other thing I'm going to do now that it's there, I'm just going to go up to Modify and Freeze Transformations. So the whole idea that this is going to be home base for this cube. Right? I'm also going to create a floor. You can see it over here. I have the outliner visible. So I have a cube, I have a plane, and I'm going to click on the inputs for the plane. And I'm just going to make its width and height, I don't know, let's just make that 30. Right? And because I have that in there, I'm going to turn off the grid, which is this little button right underneath Show. Oops, not that one. That one. And I already have turned on wireframe on shaded so that I can see my objects this way. All right, so I've got a basic setup here. I'll come back to the naming conventions a little bit later. When we animate this, the whole trick is we want to add a deformer so this can bend. So it has enough subdivisions in it. In fact, I didn't do this in class. We'll go ahead and try this. So if I just do underneath modeling and rigging, you can see it's there, and animation, there's a deform menu, because the deformers can be used for lots of different things. So whatever sub kind of menu you're using here, you should always be able to get to deform. And I'll click on this and go down to nonlinear, about a third of the way down, and I'm going to choose bend. Okay. And if I hit 4 on my keyboard, and a reminder that 4 is wireframe, 5 is shaded. We'll talk about the other hotkeys in a minute. You can see there is, there's my bend handle that's created over here in the outliner. And so it has this. If I go to curvature, now this is my middle mouse button doesn't like to work on the Mac. If I click on curvature, I should be able to just hold down the middle mouse button and you can see that little side-to-side icon. But as soon as I do that, it doesn't like to obey, I guess, right? So I'm just going to put this as like 25, right? So you can see that it deforms my object. I'm going to go back to 5. You can see it gives it as a wedge. And as we discussed in class, if I have a finger, and the finger just had one bone from the knuckle out to the tip, and I tried to bend it, I could make it bend, but that means I would have to break the bone, right? So what I'm going to do is come back and click on the cube itself, and it has a series of inputs. So we have bend, and we did the transform geometry, it's out there, but we've been using this in class. There's the polycube, and we have the width and the height and the depth, so that's the size. But then we also have the subdivisions along the width and height of the depth, and I'm going to put 10 in for all of those. And you can see now I actually get a nice clean curve in there, right? So it's not so bad. I'm going to put it back like this. So if you have not done that, go ahead and make sure that that's sitting at 10 for the subdivisions. The other thing is, as I discussed in class, boy, that little magic mouse, if I even get close to it, it thinks I'm trying to rotate around. So down here in the corner, you can see our little world axis. We have a Z, an X, and a Y. And a standard convention would be that the character would be facing forward along the Z. And I don't want the bend to go side to side. I want it to go from the front to the back, because I want the character to basically move front and back. So I'm going to come back over to the bend handle as an object, and let's just go ahead and rotate it 90 degrees. And go back to shaded mode. Right, so you can see it's bending, and it's really just kind of a pain that I have to do this numerically, but you can see the bend happening there. So I'll go ahead and leave it at 25. The problem is it's bending at the bottom and the top, and I just want it to start at the bottom and work its way all the way through. Yeah, we'll leave it just right there. So what I'm going to do with the bend handle, again, most of this is a recap. We did this in class, but the bend handle came in at the center of where the box was, but it wasn't parented. It was only parented, I guess you could say, to the world. So to go to that position, it was 0.5 on the Y. So if I just zero that out, you can see that it puts the center of the bend handle, right? It's an object, and that little center is where the handles are for it. So it's moved part of the deformer itself below the object, so it's not really having any effect. And you can see that the bend is happening here, but it's not happening at the top. And sometimes maybe that's what you want in the object itself. But in this case, that's not what we want. So if I go to the bend, and we just put 0 for the low bound. And sometimes you have to experiment to figure out which way is the low bound or the high bound facing if you reorient that. But at this point, I don't want it to bend down to the bottom. But since this was 1 and I took away -1 from the low, then I'll just add that to the high bound, and that will complete, covering the whole entire object. Is this always going to be the solution that you would use? No. Is a good solution in this case? Absolutely. Okay. So now if I do that curvature, right, you can see it's bending appropriately. And I'll just put it back to -15 if I want. Okay. So you can do minus and plus in any of these. 4, 5. Let's just go back to our shaded view. Okay. So I'm going to do a little naming real quick. So we had p^1. Let's call this boxy body. And let's call this floor. And I'm just going to leave the bend handle where it is. All right, so that's a beginning, but I don't want to have to select the object to do its deformation. Not to mention it's kind of weird with it up here at the top as far as the transform. So what I'm going to do is create a controller for this, as we discussed in class. So let's maybe go into our 4 views. And I'm going to go into wireframe, which again is 4. On the hotkeys, and I'm going to go to create NURBS primitives. And again, NURBS has a funky name, non-uniform rational B-splines. It basically just means objects created with curves. And these get used a lot in CAD operations if you're an industrial designer or mechanical engineer and stuff like that. It's just a different way of modeling. Totally cool, but we won't touch it in here. But for animation, we love to use these curves that we could draw, or just prefabs. So here's a circle, and I'm just going to put this in the scene. And I'm going to go and name this boxy _, so never any spaces, and then capitalize CTRL for control. And so anytime I create a control, I put this little suffix on this. To identify what kind of object that might be, right? This one I called it body. I could have called it, maybe a better name is body geo. Okay, so this is the geometry that I'm going to be using. All right, so here is the curve itself. The curve is made up of points that define the curve, right? And right now, so we have that curve right there. I can't really tell, though, based on where it is, which one's the front and the back. And I want to try to keep that in mind as I'm animating here, for just because. So I'm going to right click on this and on the curve, and I'll select Control Vertex. You can see these blue little dots up here on here. And so these are what are making up the surface. I'm just going to shape them a little bit. And because I want this to be symmetrical, I'm just going to left mouse button, click and drag, and draw a little marquee so that it selects those points. And the whole thing is I could move them individually, but the nice thing here is if I select the one on this side and the one on that side, and now I'm going to hit R for scale, and go ahead and just shape that a little bit. And I'll draw another marquee. Maybe I'll just bring those out a little bit. And I'm going to bring this one in a little bit. It doesn't matter. There's no exact way to do this, but it does communicate what's going on this object. So I'm going to select these two. To do multiple selections, I just hold down the Shift key. Right? You could shape this however you would want. We'll do R. Okay. Right? So you can see now this is kind of the direction it's pointing in the back side of our box, right? All right, so we have that working together. So this has just been shaped. So let's go in here. Let's just say I select everything. Oops, not the floor. I'll talk about how to reorder those. So if I select all three of those and I start moving, I can move them together like as individual things. But if I parent these, you'll see this in a sec, we want to make sure that we're only selecting the top as we go along. And we don't want to have to select this piece here. Here's the other one. We definitely don't want to do, where's the handle? Right? So this would be a great way to hurt our box. Let's do this one, right? So the example here is the geometry is like the flesh on the character, and the boxy bend one handle, is like a bone that's in there. We certainly don't want to disconnect one from the other as we go along. We don't want to accidentally select one or the other, so this is why we've created the controller. So what we're going to do is parent these together, and there's multiple ways to do this. An easy way over in the outliner is if I go in, I can hold down the left mouse button key and just drag through. Like if I were to do all this, you can see that I'm selecting. But I only want the geometry and the handle. And then I'm going to use the middle mouse button, and you can see a little plus sign shows up, right? And then when I drop that in there, you can see on top of some item in the outliner, you can see boxy control, and then we have the geometry and the handle in there. So now it's very easy for me to select that handle, right, and do whatever moving that I would want in there, right? So it's very easy to select. It's not a piece of geometry. I'm not going to dislocate. The other thing you can see here is I was trying to select, it kept wanting to try to select the floor. And I think basically Maya's freaking out with this stupid magic mouse that's on here. So being able to select or not select things is kind of important. So I'm going to select the floor itself, and I'm going to use the layers that we talked about in class. So you can move and organize the layers. You can just create an empty layer. The last one over here is going to take whatever is selected and put it in a layer. And I'm going to name that floor layer. And I'll hit save. And again, I can hide the visibility. Don't worry about the P. It has to do with playback. And there's a button here. It doesn't have any, it's not doing anything. But if I hit it once, it goes to T for template or R for reference. And if I deselect it now, you can see that I can't select the floor. And that's exactly what I want. And I'm also going to go to the boxy geometry in the handle right here. And I'm just going to create their own layer, just for whatever reason. And I'll call them boxy don't touch. And do the same thing, reference. Right? So they're blacked out. I can't touch them. The only thing I can touch now is that controller. It's going to help me animate it so I don't accidentally select things that I don't want. In the outliner, let's go ahead and when we select it, so let's say if we hadn't hit all those and we drew a marquee and we could select all of these, I'm going to grab the move tool here. Hate this little mouse, I'll tell you right now. You can see right here, if I move them, that the box is moving away from the controller. Because what's happening is I'm moving the controller, say 7 units, and then I'm moving the box itself another set number of units, and it's moving further away from the controller, right? So when we're animating in here, we only want to select the boxy control. Even though it seems like everything's highlighted, it's really only the controller that's highlighted. You can see it here, but it highlights everything that's a child of it, right? So you can see the whole hierarchy. All right. Let's see, what else? There was one other thing we talked about in class. Oh, let's go ahead and select the geometry itself. And because this has these hard edges, I mean, it looks fine, I guess, but I like it when things have a little bit of bevel on it. It looks more realistic. So if I hit 3 on my keyboard, you can see what it's done is round off those edges. Okay? And the tightness of those edges determine how much rounding is going on. If I went back to the cube and said maybe there was only 5 subdivisions, you can see it gets lumpier. If I made it 20 subdivisions, you can see that it gets a lot tighter. So I don't know if you want to mess with that for your character, but I'll just go ahead and say 10. Right, I'll just leave that at that point right now. All right, a little over 16 minutes. We'll call that good for now. Sorry for the speed round, but this is mainly just in case you forgot some of the steps that we looked at in class. Speaking of that, I will see you in class soon.